Hello! Welcome to this How Do I video on configuring new Microsoft Dynamics NAV management portal tenants using web services. In this video, you'll see how to configure your management portal applications and tenant templates to enable accessing and configuring new tenants programmatically using SOAP web services. This tutorial has 4 steps. First, it explains how to prepare the application and necessary web services. Then you see how to configure your development environment to trust the self-signed certificate provided by the management portal. Then it shows how to use both management portal API and tenant web services to create and manage users for tenants. And finally, it shows how to manage and configure companies. Let's begin. Configuring new tenants begins before you even provision your management portal application service. To be able to programmatically configure your new tenants, you must enable SOAP web services for your application service. Remember, you must do that before you start your application service, otherwise you will have unnecessary downtime. There is one more consideration to make before provisioning your application service. It's the web services you need to call to make the configuration changes. There may be several strategies here. You may want to use custom code units, XML ports, or pages. If you choose this strategy, you'll have to make those objects a part of your application database, and they must be a part of your business logic backpack file. Instead, you may decide to use standard objects to set up new tenants. Personally, I prefer this way because you don't need to deploy and maintain custom objects. If you choose this strategy, you'll have to either configure your web services locally and then make this configuration a part of your business logic backpack file, or you'll have to create a tenant for application management purposes, mount it with allow application database rights, and then use it to configure the new web services. Here, I'll demonstrate this last approach. For my application service, I'll click Add Tenant, and then in the New Tenant card, I'll assign it the name Management Tenant, select the Allow Database Rights checkbox, confirm the confirmation message, then create a new administrator user, assign its email address, and then provision the tenant. When the provisioning completes, I'll copy my temporary password from the welcome email and access my web client URL. For now, I'll continue despite the warning, and I sign into NAV. Then, I change my temporary password that management portal assigned to me with a regular one. And then I'll search for web services. Depending on how much setup and configuration you'll want to automate for your customers, you'll expose different web services here, but at minimum you'll want to publish the user card. For the purpose of my demo, I'll also publish another one, company information card. Great! Now the application service is configured and ready to provision new tenants, so let's move to the next step. Let me start by making a strong claim. You should never use self-signed certificates in your production environments. However, during development and testing, using self-signed certificates simplifies work. So in this step, I'll show how to trust the self-signed certificate issued by the management portal when you provision your application service. First, find Internet Explorer. You cannot do this using Edge or any other browser. I'll right-click iExplore.exe and choose Run as Administrator. Then I'll navigate to my management tenant web client URL, accept the warning, and then click the Untrusted Certificate badge in the address bar. Here I'll click View Certificates, then Install Certificate. In the Certificate Import Wizard, I'll select Local Machine Store, click Next, then select Place all certificates in the following store option, click Browse, then select Trusted Root Certification Authorities, and then click OK. Then I'll click Next, then Finish, and my machine now trusts my self-signed certificate. I can verify this by closing the browser, then opening it again, and navigating to the same URL once again. This time there is no warning. More than for browsing, this step was necessary in development environments so that you can easily consume SOAP web services protected using this certificate. Good. Let's now move on to see how to configure new tenants. All of these tasks can be done using other tools or frameworks that can process SOAP requests. For my demos in this video, I'll use PowerShell. Here, I have a set of functions that allows me to use Management Service API as well as web services inside provisioned tenants. And here, I have an example of how I can use those functions to create a new tenant, then create, provision, and configure an administrative account, then create a user account and assign specific permission sets to it, and finally to configure the company information. I'll run this script in chunks and explain the details as I go. In the first block, I create an application tenant, then provision it. This part is explained in the How Do I video on getting started with Management Portal Web Services API, so I won't go into those details here. The set tenant commandlet sets the newly provisioned tenant in scope for the rest of my session. I pipe my tenant information into the create application tenant user commandlet, which calls the application tenant user service of the Management Portal API. I pipe the new user information into the provision application tenant user commandlet, where I call the new method of the application tenant user service. This is equivalent to clicking provision for a user account manually entered in the tenant card in the Management Portal UI. If I passed password information, then this function will also assign a specific password to the new user account. Also, if the tenant user is an administrative user, the function stores this information in my session for later use. Finally, it returns the provision user object that I pipe into the set tenant user commandlet, which stores this information in my session for later use. When it completes, I'll verify that my tenant is provisioned together with an administrative user account. I'll sign in to my tenant web client to verify my user account is properly configured. When you create an administrative account, it automatically gets assigned super permission set. Every database must have a super user. However, you want your regular users to have more restrictive role-based access. Therefore, I will now create a regular user and assign to it those permission sets specific to sales and receivables order processor role. I'll start by creating and provisioning a new non-administrative user account. This executes the same commandlets I ran earlier, only this time the account is a simple user that will require role-based access. When the provisioning completes, I can look up this account in my tenant database and confirm that it has no permission sets assigned. Let me now assign those permission sets. Assigning permission sets to the user account is something that Management Portal API does not do. You can use Management Portal API to create user accounts and provision them in the tenant databases. However, to assign permission sets to them, you must use tenant web services. That's why I have two commandlets here. First, I have getTenantUser commandlet that retrieves the NAV user object from the database using the user card page web service. This function first creates a tenant web service proxy for the user card page. This helper function combines the elements of the tenant web service URL, uses credentials stored in the current state, and then creates and caches the web service proxy, or simply retrieves a service proxy from the cache if it's already there. Back to getTenantUser function, it now creates a new instance of the user filter object, sets it to filter on the username field, and look for the value of the specified username. Then it retrieves this user account from the web service and returns it. I then pipe this user into the setUserPermissionSet commandlet. Let's take a look at it. It receives the user, the company to give user access to, and the array of strings representing permission sets. It then creates the web service proxy for the user card page. Then it creates a list of user line objects. User line corresponds to the permission subpage, and even though it may look confusing, it's the name automatically assigned to this object by the SOAP layer of NAV. So I'll simply populate this list with individual user permission sets that I'll create from the string array passed into the function. Then I'll convert this list to an array and assign it to the permissions property of my user object. Finally, I call the update method of the user card page web service. After this completes, I will go back to my tenant web client, search for the users page, select my new user, and confirm that it has all these permission sets assigned. Apart from creating users and assigning permission sets to them, setting up new tenants may involve many more tasks, like configuring company information card, general ledger setup, and various other setup cards, configuring chart of accounts, for example, or configuring your specific vertical solution. All of these can be automated using various web services. The principle of calling into these web services is the same, and here I'll just show the example of configuring company information card. It's a very simple function that receives necessary parameters, then creates the proxy for the company information web service, then reads the company information card, populates it with values, and finally updates it. When I call this block, I can verify that my company information is updated. Back in my web client, I search for my company information and run it. I can see here that all of the values assigned from PowerShell are present as expected. Let's summarize what we have learned today. We have first discussed various ways of preparing the application and the necessary web services. Typically, you will prepare the application and have the configuration ready in a backpack, but you can also mount a management tenant with permission to write to your application database. Then, you have seen how to trust your self-signed certificates in your development, test, or sandbox environments. Even though this works nicely, always use certificates issued by a trusted authority for your production environments. Then, you have seen how to combine Management Portal API with tenant web services to provision new user accounts, set their passwords, and assign their permission sets. And finally, you have seen how to set up companies by calling into tenant web services on the example of the company information card page web service. In this video, we covered configuring the application service, trusting self-signed certificates, and consuming tenant SOAP web services from PowerShell. To learn more about the Microsoft Dynamics Managed Service for Partners, please visit http://aka.ms NAV Managed Service. Also, the script I demonstrated here is available on GitHub. It is provided as is. It's an unsupported community project with no warranties that you use entirely at your own responsibility. I hope you enjoyed this How Do I video. Thanks for watching and happy provisioning.